this talk. We're really excited to share our work with you, which I will try to do now. There we go. Hope that works. Um, we're really excited to talk to you about our work over the past year in what we've been doing to modify how linguistics is taught in our department at the University of Toronto. Our work focuses on trying to increase equity, diversity, and inclusion, or EDI for short, we'll be calling it that, in our courses. And we hope that some of the methods that we present here will be useful to you to combat language-based biases in your own teaching. So, oops. There we go. So we'll begin with a brief background on what kinds of language-based biases we're talking about here. Then we'll give an overview of our EDI initiative. And then the heart of the talk is the components of that initiative. And I won't go through the list right now, but we'll go through these in more depth during the talk. And then finally, we'll wrap up with some thoughts about what worked, what didn't, and why. So language-based biases. Linguists have come to a general consensus that all languages are valid and all language varieties are valid, and not just as objects of study within linguistics itself, but as ways for people to use language. This is a social validity as well. But as we're painfully aware, society doesn't pay very much attention to what we as linguists have to say. So languages are still marginalized, disadvantaged, stigmatized, and oppressed in many different ways. And we see this happen with non-standard dialects, sign languages, minoritized languages, indigenous languages, and I'm sure you can think of other ways that languages and language varieties are disadvantaged. And don't get comfortable or smug talking about society. Despite our general consensus, we linguists still need to clean up our own house too. We have our own biases. We're often subject to external institutional biases, such as being expected to use standardized English and enforce that for our students, evaluate their fluency. And this disproportionately disadvantages minoritized students, immigrants, students with learning differences, poorer students, people who just don't have native fluency in a standardized variety of English. And then we have our own individual unconscious biases, which can lead to common linguistic microaggressions, such as mispronouncing a minoritized student's name, or misgendering or dead naming a trans or non-binary student. And these microaggressions can have a severe detrimental effects on a student's mental health and academic success as they build up over time. Language-based biases also permeate our field as a whole, so not just at the individual level, but institutionally and structurally in the field. Our linguistic examples, for example, often reinforce unjust hierarchies and stereotypes, such as those concerning gender and culture. And there's the famous Macaulay and Bryce 97, as well as follow-ups to that in recent years, which show that not much has changed. We also, as linguists, often present spoken language as the default, leaving students with minimal understanding of sign languages, sign language linguistics, or deaf communities. And as linguists, we should know better and do better. Following in the spirit of Saussure's tâche du linguiste, and following many recent calls to action for increased attention to issues of social justice and linguistics, Rickford and King, Leonard, Conrad, Charity Hudley, etc., we call upon linguists to combat language-based biases in their teaching. We single out teaching here specifically because this is where we begin training the next generation of linguists. No matter how aware we might be as individuals or as a field of our own language-based biases, if we don't do anything about it, we're going to pass them on to our students and continue the cycle in our field. In the rest of this talk, we'll describe an ongoing initiative that we've engaged in where we try to heed this call to action on this issue. So what is this initiative, this EDI initiative that we have engaged in? A couple of years ago, in the fall of 2018, at the University of Toronto, there was a sort of synergy and serendipity between ongoing conversations on the one hand in the sociolinguistics research group and a recent faculty hire, me, who had a specific interest in social justice and pedagogy. And I had just started teaching a new first-year seminar on language and social justice. And so we came together and realized we had some common interests, and this gave us a push to start doing things. I began working with Professors Karen Rice and Naomi Nagy in consultation with members of the sociolinguistics group and the department at large. And we wrote a grant for the Learning and Education Advancement Fund, or LEAF grant, through the Faculty of Arts and Science at U of T. And the title of our grant is Innovations in Linguistic Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion in the Linguistics Curriculum and Beyond. The grant was approved, fortunately. And it's a 3-year grant beginning with this most recent academic year. We have funding to pay for 2 full-time graduate student positions, what we call Lead Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Teaching Assistants. And the first 2 of those are my collaborators here, co-presenters, Pocholo Umbal and Lex Konnelly. The main goals of this initiative are raise explicit awareness of language-related bias in course content. So change what is actually taught in a course to students as content for them to learn. We also want to diversify the data that we use, trying to avoid major spoken European languages and start looking at other languages and language varieties. Create more inclusive and welcoming learning spaces for our students, especially those from more diverse, linguistically diverse backgrounds. We want to build a repository of resources and tools for instructors around the world to be able to do this same kind of initiative at their own institutions. And we want to bring in guest speakers to broaden our perspective and to challenge us. For this first year, our primary strategy was to collaborate with instructors for 2 courses per semester, so 4 courses total, to devise individualized approaches that suited their needs for their own courses, their comfort level, their abilities and expertise, while also satisfying our goals for the initiative. Meanwhile, we also worked on projects behind the scenes separate from those specific courses. Okay, so the 5 components of our initiative. So one of the first things we did was work on course content. And working in my introductory phonetics course in the fall, we expanded 3 weeks of the course material to bring an explicit focus to language-based bias as content. So this was new information in this course, in a phonetics course, that the students were expected to learn, were tested on, had homework assignments on, and so forth. The first bit of course content we changed was in the unit on modeling vowel acoustics. So this is the classic tube models of vowels, calculating resonant frequencies and so forth. And we added content concerning gender diversity to problematize the notion of typical male-female vocal tracts, because this is something that often gets talked about in a phonetics course. We're often taught to calculate resonant frequency of the vocal tract with a default 17.5 centimeter vocal tract length. We're probably all very familiar with that number. It's because it nicely divides the speed of sound in warm, moist air. It's a mathematically nice number, but we're also told that in addition to this mathematical niceness, that this length is typical or average or bizarrely neutral for adult males. And then this is the number that we work with. And this perpetuates male as default, which is already a problem in the sciences, and it masks body diversity within and across genders. Vocal tracts vary a lot between genders. So this is something that we added to the course content that students needed to learn about. The second bit was in the unit on auditory perception, and we added content concerning the effect of social biases on speech perception. Speech perception is often taught very mechanically with a primary or sole focus just on the physical functions of the ear. What are the effects of resonance in the auditory canal and so forth? How does the cochlea work? However, there's a lot of research out there showing that a lot of social information also plays a very important role in how we perceive language. And so we can't rely just on auditory perception alone. Um, for example, in a study by Babel and Russell, native speakers of Canadian English were judged on how intelligible they sounded. And some of them were of Chinese descent, some were not, some were white, and some were shown with their faces and some were not. And what they found was that if somebody of Chinese descent was shown with their face, even though they're a native speaker of Canadian English, they were perceived as less intelligible, harder to understand, but not when the faces were invisible. They were judged equal to their white counterparts. And this kind of knowledge is important so that students understand, first of all, that the physical properties of the ear are not just enough to explain perception, but also moving forward so that they're aware of, for example, how they may subconsciously rate racialized instructors worse than white instructors. It's not uncommon at all for racialized instructors to have their speech commented on in evaluations. The third bit of course content was in the unit on sign language phonetics, which was something that I had already added to this course prior to the initiative. And we added further content to discuss how sign languages are often minimized or excluded in linguistics itself as a field. Spoken languages are the assumed default. Linguistics courses are regularly taught with no significant discussion of sign languages at all. But an analogous course with no significant discussion of spoken languages, that's just rare. And when they do exist, they're usually overtly marked. You have sign language phonetics, sign language syntax, in contrast to phonetics and syntax. And we know what this kind of differential marking means socially. In addition, it's quite common for an undergraduate linguistics major to never work with any sign language data at all, ever. But the reverse for an undergraduate major to never work with any spoken language data. That's just inconceivable to us as linguists. It would be highly improper. This is the kind of student that probably wouldn't get into a graduate school. Like, there's something wrong with their background if they never worked with a spoken language. But if they never worked with the sign language, we don't have a problem with it. And so this is something we wanted to challenge with this course content. This attitude implicitly treats sign languages and deafness as atypical phenomena that could be minimized or even outright ignored. And by extension, it implies that deaf people can be ignored. And this mirrors society at large. We're just reflecting what society is already doing. And this is something, again, as linguists, we should be better at. Further, by focusing primarily or exclusively on spoken languages, our field misses out on a huge amount of relevant knowledge from other modalities. Language is not just spoken language. Sign languages have knowledge to give us about how language works. And worse still, linguists often behave as if this knowledge isn't even important. And they'll make broad proclamations about how language works without having ever checked to see what sign languages do. The second component of our initiative was to diversify data. And here we worked with Professor Peter Jurgitz in his introductory phonology course in the fall. And here our focus for our initiative was to replace or supplement data from major standardized European languages with other languages and language varieties. And to his credit, Peter had already been doing this himself, and so we just helped push even further what he was doing. So in addition to creating new ordinary phonology data sets from languages such as Cantonese, Sundanese, and Tagalog, we also created data sets demonstrating sociolinguistic variation and change in lesser studied language varieties, such as Faroese, Gunluau Ursu, and Toronto Heritage Russian. We also organized workshops with the instructors and teaching assistants of the courses that we worked on in both semesters to discuss best practices for teaching a diverse student body. Our focus was twofold. First, on just general social respect for students and their identities, gender, name, and so forth. But also we wanted to focus as linguists on respecting their linguistic background, especially with an eye towards empowering students as language experts. So this is something we really tried to hammer home with the teaching assistants. The fourth component is a repository of tools and resources that we want to make available to instructors across the world. So in addition to the various lecture notes, data sets, and homework problems that we've been designing for these courses over the past year, we're also working to build certain types of databases to help linguists construct more diverse and inclusive example sentences. So for example, we're building a database of names for each letter of the English alphabet. And these names come from a variety of languages and cultures categorized by gender, a three-way distinction between feminine, masculine, and non-binary. And we're confirming all of these names with native speakers. And here you can see a sample of the names that we're coming up with. And the idea here is instead of defaulting to John and Mary and Alice and Bob and Carol, that you can start drawing from this database to build examples. We also plan, and this is just in the planning stages, we haven't done any work on this yet, to build a database of predicates and sentence frames categorized by argument structure and other relevant syntactic and semantic properties, with the goal of avoiding the more problematic and offensive types of predicates and sentence frames that linguists often gravitate to, those with violence, gender stereotypes, and so forth. And finally, the fifth component is beginning next year, we're going to invite guest speakers to address various aspects of social justice and its relationship to linguistics. Our first speaker, we're really excited to have her speak to us, is Ann Charity Hudley from the University of California, Santa Barbara, who was an inspiration for a lot of the work that we're doing here. And she's scheduled to speak in October. Given the pandemic, I doubt that she will be coming physically, unfortunately, but she is still going to speak. So some final thoughts on what worked, what didn't, and so on. Time management and advanced preparation are key here. We were really crunched for time, especially in the second semester. The first semester went smoothly because we had time beforehand to brainstorm and make an action plan. But that second semester was really rough. The time between the two semesters is very short, and it's not very optimal for doing work. You've got holidays, travel, spending time with family, needing to recover from fall semester. It just wasn't an ideal time to get any significant planning done. So we had to start doing planning in the spring, in the second semester. And so that was rough. So our recommendation here is that if you're going to do this for something throughout the whole year, start planning the entire year during the summer rather than trying to do one semester at a time. The nature of the course matters. Sociolinguistics and field methods, we just didn't even bother. There, these issues come up naturally as part of the course content, so it wasn't a high priority target for us. Phonology was pretty easy to work on. Data sets are generally easier to find and work with if you're not a phonologist. But syntax is hard. We worked with Professor Susanna Behar for her introductory syntax course in the second semester, and it was difficult to find data sets that could be easily slotted into her materials. And not because her materials are difficult, just syntax is a harder field to do this work in. Semantics is harder. We worked with Professor Guillaume Thomas for his introductory semantics course. And here we were trying to think more broadly about how semantics is taught. The language of instruction in semantics is often used as the object language. So if you're teaching in English, you study English semantics. And this can be difficult for L2 learners. And so this is something we really wanted to be sensitive to. And so this was difficult because it's rethinking how semantics is even taught. Expertise and buy-in matter. Phonetics and phonology happen to be easier for us because that's something that that all of us had collective expertise in. Next year, our plan is to bring in somebody with syntax and semantics expertise. And obviously, this doesn't work without instructor buy-in. I was fully committed because I'm the PI of this project, and we're grateful that the individual professors we work with and the department of the whole have been very enthusiastic and supportive in this project. Funding helps. I won't go through this, but find funding. This could not have been done without properly funding the graduate students. Graduate students need proper financial compensation for the work they do. So we hope that we've provided a model that will inspire other linguists to answer our call to action: combat language-based biases in your teaching. As we've shown, this can be addressed in various different ways. Pick and choose what works for you. Caveat, we don't have all the answers. There are pieces of the puzzle that we're missing, and there's surely something that we're getting wrong. There are countless ways that bias can be manifested and countless solutions to that. One group or individual cannot do this perfectly. This is a communal effort, and we must all contribute and support each other. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so we have about 9 minutes for questions, and you can submit questions in the chat window. You can give a question. So we have a question now from Catherine Anderson. So you can turn on your video. Hi. I think you might. Okay, there you go.
Yep. Yeah. Okay. You got me. Okay.
Yep.
Good. Hi, Nathan. This is and your colleagues who are there. This is really lovely work, and I'm really glad to see that it's funded in this way. That you've got the graduate RAs to support that work. It mirrors a lot of the work, and you and I have had this conversation before that I've been doing in my own courses. I'm really excited about this repository, and I'm wondering if you anticipate that it will be open for contributions by other linguists along the way.
Yes, so definitely we want it to be an open resource where people can add things. This is something, it's a little off in the future. We don't know yet what this will look like, but definitely we want it to be addable.
Yeah, awesome. Well, and I'm thinking in the last 10 years or so, more of the full-time faculty are teaching profs, and this is the kind of thing that this is our responsibility, is not just to teach classes, but to be developing materials. So those people at our various institutions, we're the team that's going to do that. So
yeah,
hey,
great. Thanks.
Okay, there's a question I'm going to read, but before that, I'm just going to mention that this session is being recorded. So also and will be available for people to watch later, people who weren't able to be here. So there's a question from Angelica Hernandez asking, have you looked at attitudes of students towards being instructed with examples, names, or phrases from non-standard language varieties and or minority languages? I'm currently working with communities of Creole speakers in the US Virgin Islands, and while the professors at the university are supportive, the students and community are not always.
Yeah, so this is something I've thought about this, but we haven't talked about actually analyzing what the student response to these culturally and linguistically diverse names are. Yeah, I get, because I know one of the issues that has come up that people have talked about with this is if you change things too much and it's no longer John and Mary, but other names, that people will start focusing on the names rather than the linguistic facts that you're supposed to be extracting from these example sentences. And so that could be a problem. However, my view is, yeah, there might be some growing pains with this, but if we normalize this and it becomes the norm that example sentences in linguistics are just littered with names from all over the place, it won't be an issue in the future. But that's an empirical question, and no, we haven't looked into that. Yeah, thanks.
I have a maybe related question. Just wondering if you had any feedback from students, if you were able to get any feedback from students on these initiatives or any concerns they have in this area. Like, was there any consultation with the undergraduates themselves about diversity and inclusion?
So this is something we really wanted to do, and we had an evaluation of effectiveness survey that we were going to use. We didn't, unfortunately, do this in the first semester, and then the pandemic sort of derailed our plans to do this in the second semester. So our goal is to do this next year. And what we want to do is ask these questions to students, not just in the courses that have had this EDI initiative targeting them, but in other courses, because we want to, compare what students' responses are to their knowledge of the social complexity of the world in a regular course versus another course. And how do they feel about how their identities have been represented? So that's the type of questions that we've got here. And we're certainly open to we've got time for this, so open to further thoughts on what kinds of questions we want to ask. We want to be careful, though, not to ask too many difficult questions, because then we just don't get the student response. So we really, I think we've got it down to the bare minimum here: 3 Likert scale questions and then 1 free response. And I think it covers most of the things that we would want to know. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. There's a question from Julie.
Hi. So I was thinking about the unfamiliar names and the gendered unfamiliar names, and when that's important for linguistic judgments. For example, in a binding theory problem where one would bind herself versus himself. And I'm asking, have you thought about how to best practices for how to present that so that the people reading the sentences, analyzing the sentences, and judging the sentences know the gender of the names? And I also want to point out that this is not just a problem for unfamiliar names, it just becomes more salient for unfamiliar names. In the last, I invigilated an exam where there was an English name that was gendered, and a lot of students didn't know, a lot of the international students didn't know the gender of the name. And so this, whatever these best practices are, they should actually be used also for English names probably. But I just was wondering if you thought about what they should be.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've answered part of the question yourself, which is this needs to be done no matter what. If you expect students to treat name X as female, then that needs to be encoded in the assignment. You can't just assume that everybody is going to, even a really common name like Mary. Mary may not refer to a person who is female. Mary might be non-binary. And so that's something that we can't just assume that students are going to know. And we should challenge that assumption if that is an assumption they're making. So I think this is something that should be done explicitly in the instructions to the assignment, where you say the female participants in this discourse are ABC, the male participants are XYZ, the non-binary participants are alpha, beta, gamma. I was trying to figure out another 3 set there. And that's what you have to do, I think, if the gender is going to be important for the grammaticality. Yeah.
Thank you.
There's a question from Christina Cuervo. Have you considered trying to incorporate students' languages or language varieties in systematic or regular ways as part of the project?
So this is something, going back to the workshops that we talked about with the TAs, here we go. This is something this is an ongoing conversation about how can we do this? And I know this is something that is talked about a lot more in language education research. And so the pedagogy around language education often talks about bringing in multilingual students' backgrounds as a benefit. And so that's something we want to do more research on, is what are their methods, what are their strategies for doing this? So right now we were mostly just having conversations and brainstorming ideas with the TAs. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. That's the end of the question period for this talk, and we're going to move on to the next speaker. Thanks very much.
Thank you.